Welcome back to Careers Explained. Today we're talking with Mimi Schwanda about her career path and current role. She received her bachelor's degree from Davidson College in mathematics and her master's in education from the University of Virginia. Her previous work experience includes working as a teaching assistant in Andover, Massachusetts, and she is currently a math teacher at Episcopal High School. Welcome, Mimi, and thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Heidi. Thanks for having me.
Can you start by telling us what you do in your current role as a math teacher?
I'd love to. So I am a high school math teacher. The school where I am is a 9th through 12th boarding school. So it's 100% boarding. All the students live here and I live here as well with my family. So my typical day, I teach math as my primary role. So I have 2 classes of pre-calculus, which is mostly 11th grade students, and 2 classes of advanced calculus AB, which is mostly 12th grade students. And then I live in a dorm. So my other big part of my role is I'm the dorm head of a dorm that is 10 through 12th graders, all girls. The school is co-ed, but my dorm is just a girls' dorm. And so that looks like one night a week I'm on duty, checking kids in, making sure they're studying and building relationships with them.
And then breaking down both of those roles that you have as a math teacher, you mentioned the classes you teach. What does that look like in terms of roles and responsibilities of how you make sure you're prepared for those classes and the work it entails?
Yeah, great question. So I'm actually in my 17th year of teaching. So it was a lot more work at the beginning. But now I've been teaching the same classes long enough that it's not quite as much work as it used to be. But typically the prep is I have homework that's assigned every night. So I make sure I have that done and kind of ready to go over with the students when they come in. And then we're on a block schedule. So most of our classes are 70 minutes. So I plan what that 70 minutes is going to look like. So one of my goals is for them to not sit and listen to me talk for 70 minutes. So usually what it is a little mini lesson that's about 10 or 15 minutes of what I call direct instruction, like me in the front of the room explaining whatever it is we're learning. And then the rest of the time, something more active. So they're either in small groups doing problem sets with each other, practicing the material, or they're up on their feet working on the whiteboards, practicing practice problems while I kind of walk around and check. And then sometimes there'll be something a little more, something that takes like the whole period where they're working on more like a project or something like that. But that's my typical day. So that's the prep I need to do, is get all those things ready. 2 things that are nice about it. One, I already mentioned that I've been doing this for a long time. So if I had a great thing I did 5 years ago, then I can just keep on working off of that and just making small tweaks. And I also work in a team. So there's 4 of us teachers who teach pre-calculus. And then there's me and one other guy who teaches calculus. So we can bounce ideas off each other and take turns with lesson planning and that sort of thing.
And with the lesson plans, you've been doing it for 17 years. Sounds like you can recycle some things when it's applicable.
Yeah.
Are you setting the agenda of what your annual goals are for students to learn, or is it based off of, like you mentioned, AB, like maybe some national standard testing? How do you figure out what you're prepping for?
Yeah, that's a great question again. So we're an independent school. So if I worked at a public school, it would be much more regimented in terms of like standards, and there's certain standards of learning you have to cover as a pre-calculus teacher, for example. And we have something similar. It's just developed more in-house. So we sit down as a math department and say like, okay, when a kid finishes pre-calculus, what do they need to know? And usually it's based on what they need to know for whatever class they're going into for the next year. So pre-calculus, as the name implies, we want to make sure they're prepared for calculus. So we'll kind of make a list of standards and then schedule out the year accordingly. For my calculus class, they don't have to take the AP exam, but I am kind of committed to making sure they are prepared for the AP if they want to take it. And so that's super helpful because that gives me a topic list and a pacing guide and a structure so that by the time the second week in May comes around, they've gotten all the material they need to hopefully find success on that test if that's something they're interested in.
5s all around from
Exactly. 5s for everybody.
to do it. And then you mentioned kind of the block schedule and how many classes you're teaching. Can you walk through your typical schedule in a week, and if there are any blocks in there for you to do prep, what that looks like?
Yeah, I'm lucky in that I don't have to do tons of work at night because there's free blocks built into my day. So the way it works is all the classes meet 3 times a week. Every class meets on a Monday. So we have 40-minute classes where the students run through all 7 of their classes. So I teach 4 out of 7 of those. So on a Monday, I'm teaching 4 and I'm off for 3 of those 40-minute sections. And then from there, the classes meet either Tuesday, Thursday, or Wednesday, Friday. So it's a little bit like a college schedule. So all of the students' classes either meet Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, since they see all their classes on Monday. And then every day except Monday, the blocks are 75, I think 75 minutes. So that it's built that way so that on Monday, they're getting the FaceTime with every teacher. They're getting kind of a quick check-in. I mean, quick, 40 minutes is still enough time to do some things, but getting that face-to-face with all their teachers at the end after the weekend, and then using the rest of the week to dive deeper into some learning. And so yeah, that's what my block schedule looks like. But to answer your free time question. So like on a Tuesday, for example, there are 3 blocks and I teach 2 out of the 3. So my 4 classes that I teach are broken up over 2 meet Tuesdays and Thursdays and 2 meet Wednesday and Fridays. So I have at least 1 free block every day to grade or prep or chat with a colleague, whatever I might need to do.
And then when the blocks of whether it's 40 minutes or 70-minute periods end at the end of the day and students go home, are you also going home with them, or are you staying to a different time to get the rest of the work done?
Yeah. So on a typical day, the day ends around 3 o'clock. On Tuesdays and Thursdays afternoon, there's office hours. So similar to a college setting, I'm in my classroom and students can come by and get help or practice for an assessment. The students are actually pretty good about using that time, and it's been really fulfilling for me. That's where I build a lot of those one-on-one connections when kids come by and want to get help or work on the homework for the next day sometimes. And so personally, my schedule has changed a little bit this year. So my oldest daughter is in kindergarten now, and she gets off the bus at 3 o'clock. So some days I'm kind of hustling out to meet her at the bus stop. And my younger son's in daycare, which goes till 5. So my old schedule was like, I'd kind of hang out and finish up my work and go home like around 4 or 4:30. But now my husband and I are still kind of honestly figuring out what the afternoons look like. But in theory, I have a little time in the afternoon to get some prep and grading done for the next day.
Now on a more annual basis, because from the student perspective, there are breaks, summer break, and some along there. Can you give the teacher perspective of when do you have off and when are you working when students might not be?
Yeah, so I actually have the breaks. Like I'm a 10-month employee. So when it's summer, I'm shutting down. Like every so often I might do some professional development, like go to a conference or spend an intensive few days with another teacher if we're gonna like totally revamp how we're gonna teach a class the next year or something. But our school's actually kind enough to give funding if we decide to do like a deep dive project. But yeah, a week off at Thanksgiving, 2 weeks off at Christmas. We actually have a 2-week spring break, which is amazing. And then, yeah, pretty much June, July, August off. So everybody's right when they say it's a great perk to teaching, because it is. It's not like there's secret work to be done. And unless it's something I opt into, like I said, like if there was a really cool one summer, I did like a teaching leadership conference that was in Colorado. So I was there for 5 days. But that's
awesome.
by choice.
Exactly. Trial by choice. And it gets funded too. So you get to get better and
Yeah, exactly.
whole summer, 5 days out of it. And
Right.
then when you're planning your lessons or your agenda for the entire class, are you typically doing that? I know you mentioned you have time during the blocks, but the overarching planning, is that happening in real time during the semester, or at the start, are you ready with the plan?
Yeah, I've learned over the years that it doesn't really work to, sit down in August and plan out what I'm going to do every day through the end of May, because I haven't met the students yet. We don't really know how things are going to pace. Even year to year, I might need more time or less time with certain topics. So we have 1 week of, we call it faculty meeting week, but in August before the students come back. And so built into that time is math department time. So we sit down and typically we pace out like the first 6 weeks just to kind of have that plan until, maybe the middle of October. And then we carve out another, free block or after school time to kind of plan out the next chunk. And that's where that teamwork piece that I mentioned earlier comes in handy, because then we all teach on the same hall. So basically every day we're saying like, okay, did you get through what we thought we were going to get through? Do we need to build in another day on this material? So it's pretty fluid in terms of, we want to have something planned, but we have the flexibility to go faster or slower depending on student need.
And it sounds like you all follow the same plan. You work together to make it, and you make sure you're step by step. Is that the case?
Yeah, it's yes and no. I mean, we have the flexibility to kind of like own our own classroom in terms of, if there's a problem that I'm more excited about or less excited about, then we can shift a little bit from what our colleagues are doing. But at the same time, we're committed to it being generally the same experience. Like if you're an 11th grade student who signed up for pre-calculus and you have me versus one of my colleagues, you shouldn't have a night and day, totally different experience. Like it should be fairly lockstep in terms of my personality coming out versus his, but at the same time, like the material that you're seeing and covering. And for the most part, our assessments are exactly the same, just so we don't want one person to get the reputation of being the easy teacher or the hard teacher, because that is never good.
And kids talk, so
Yeah.
nice. And so it sounds like some things you mentioned you like are the collaboration with other people, the breaks, maybe the schedule overall. Any things that you want to mention you like or find challenging about the role?
Sure. Yeah, it's pretty all consuming. So I mentioned the boarding piece. So there are, of course, pros and cons to living at my work. I think the challenge is just that, the work, it just kind of never ends. There's always a kid I could follow up with, or more prep I could do to make an assessment better or an activity better. I've learned over the years about having appropriate boundaries, like saying that it's time for my family, or saying like the work needs to be done, or saying, these students can get their test back one day later so that I'm not grading tests instead of hanging out with my husband, just like figuring out where I can put up boundaries and still follow through with my commitments. And just generally, like the world of working with teenagers is complicated and hard. And so, we're in the middle of a mental health crisis and kids are on their phones all the time. Any of the sort of like classic things you hear about teenagers are very real. And, dealing with kids that are mean to each other and kind of like all the things you could think about that teenagers might be doing, we're kind of like right in the thick of it with them. And so that's hard. And it can be heartbreaking, like you get really close to kids and then they go through challenging times and you're in it with them. And those things, that's when I'm really thankful to have a great team too, because we have an awesome counseling staff and just other colleagues who have relationships with the kids too. So I never feel like I'm shouldering these burdens alone, but you do get invested and kids do go through challenging things. So that can be hard.
Definitely teenage years. I think everyone's had at least personal or is watching someone else go through stuff. And I imagine at a boarding school, you'd get an even closer lens than maybe a day school at whatever students are going through.
For sure.
And can you talk about any opportunities for moving up? You mentioned 17 years of teaching. Are there typical steps, or do you plan maybe to stay same role?
Yeah. So typically it's nice because at least at my school, when you come in, you're kind of like doing the typical load. So everyone teaches and coaches and does dorm duty. So dorm duty is like what I described before, where you help supervise one night a week. And coaching. So all of our kids do either a sport or some other afternoon commitment, like yearbook or a play or music. And so when I first came, I was teaching my 4 classes of math. I was coaching cross country and track, and I was doing my dorm commitment. And over the years, moving up is more, at least in my career so far, it's more, for me, it's looked more like what can I drop and what can I pick up? Like where can I be more passionate about what I'm working on? And because of that, step away from something else. And our administration has been super encouraging with that. And, different seasons of life. Like once I became a mom, where did I need to think about my work-life balance a little bit differently? So things that I've stepped into, like I work very closely with our student leaders. So similar to like the college RAs, we have students that help run the dorms. And so that group of students, I'm their faculty advisor. So I stepped into that about 10 years ago. And then I also help with one of the things that our school prides itself in is how close we are to DC, which is something that a lot of boarding schools don't have. Many boarding schools are kind of in the middle of nowhere. So I work on a team where we kind of plan programming for how we can get kids into DC. So, or bring DC to us, like cool speakers or workshops or different opportunities. So that's like experiential learning work that I help with. Yeah, I mean, I think for some people, there's a kind of a clear ladder for people that are teachers who want to be administrators. That's kind of like the classic move up, like if you want to be a dean of students or a head of an upper school or eventually a head of school. So I've certainly seen colleagues kind of like follow that sort of ladder. But for me, my favorite thing about my job is actually being in the classroom teaching and being with students. And I've found that a lot of administration work takes people away from the classroom. And so for me, for now, I love teaching. And so I don't want to step away from that part of my job. That being said, like I'm kind of seeing myself as a career school person. So like 5-10 years from now, I might need a new challenge and kind of be done with my main work being teaching the same thing I've taught for decades. So we'll see. But for now, I'm not kind of like anxious to get into administration. I always say like, I'd rather be with the kids than talking about the kids with other adults.
Boots on the ground,
Yeah,
experience
exactly.
classroom,
Getting
getting
there with the kids.
and if you get tired, there are other ways to go out, but I like that there's two paths. You can customize staying in the classroom, what activity,
Yeah.
or you can go into administration if that's of interest.
And of course, that's really important work. And I've loved seeing my friends go into that work. Well, and the other thing that I picked up recently that I mentioned, so I'm in my second year of a job called dorm head, which is the person who lives in the dorm and is kind of like the point person for all the students and their parents who are in that space. So the reason I applied for this position, which I guess is kind of moving up, is because kind of like what I was just saying, that I wanted, or what you said too, like wanted to be boots on the ground, wanted to be really in the mix with where the students were facing their high highs and low lows and be in it with them. And so it's been really rewarding.
That's talk about a full time, even off the clock,
Totally.
in with them and all of the things that they're experiencing that we talked about, hopefully highs and lows. But and that's a full schedule you have there. It
I
sounds.
know. Well, and that's why I mentioned what I said about boundaries. I think I've learned because when you're new, you feel like you have to say yes to everything and be like, I'm here, I'm ready to help anytime you need me. And that can be dangerous because then all of a sudden you've said yes to too much. But I've been here long enough that I've learned I work one night a week in the dorm, like Monday nights is my dorm night. And then besides that, if there's an emergency, of course, call, but I have a team of adults that supervise on the other nights. And I've also just kind of learned how to do my work during the day, if that makes sense. So like, let's say there was a roommate conflict, like two girls that were having a hard time getting along as roommates. I could go out and talk to them about that at 8 p.m. or I could follow up with them the next day at lunch. And so I've learned how to kind of like do my work in work hours when I can be in charge of when things happening rather than assume like, oh my gosh, I have to go talk to them instead of hanging out with my family right this second. So, but that takes time.
And that's such an important lesson that is more of an informal one that you kind of learned through experience. Whereas kind of on the flip side of that, how are you trained in both? You have the two roles, it sounds like, in the classroom and also your roles as a dorm head.
Yeah.
What is the formal training for both of those?
So for the inside the classroom part, well, you mentioned in my intro, I do have a master's in education from UVA. So I did that over the course of a couple summers. So that helped me in terms of lesson plans and kind of like backwards planning, like if I want the kids to know this, how do I get there? Kind of like the nitty gritty of the teaching. I learned a lot of that in grad school, but I also just kind of learned informally from my colleagues and by doing. Sure. One of the blessings of independent school versus public school is you're just kind of like, you get the job and then it's like, here's your classroom, go teach. There's not like a lot of formal oversight, which is great unless you're a brand new teacher and just want someone to tell you you're doing a good job. And so I learned early on, like the sort of no news is good news, ask questions, go visit other teachers and watch them teach. And luckily I'm in an amazingly supportive department with a lot of experienced teachers. So I've learned a lot from my colleagues. As far as the dorm head piece, I think a lot of that was learning by my experience here. So until last year, all my years before that, I was a member of a dorm team, like I mentioned. So I was still doing dorm duty one night a week and getting to spend time in the res life side of things, but not the dorm head, kind of like reporting to the dorm head. Because a lot of that work is there's not like a class you can take. Like we have formal training at the beginning of the year where we do some case studies and we talk about scenarios, but you don't really know what exactly is going to pop up. A lot of it is just trusting my gut and leaning on my colleagues when I need to.
Going with the flow. And I like that you mentioned the difference between being an independent school where it's maybe more on you to ask when you have questions and seek out that advice where needed, as opposed to the oversight. Can you explain what made you interested in working at an independent school and at being a teacher in general?
Yeah, so I was the kid that always said I wanted to be a teacher when I grew up, even as a little girl. My mom just retired from a long career as a kindergarten teacher. So I always loved kids and I played school when I was a kid and all that. And so I wanted to be a kindergarten teacher like my mom. And then when I was in 11th grade, I had this amazing math teacher. It's going to make me cry telling the story, but I had this awesome math teacher and I realized I was good at math. And then all my friends I watched who struggled with math, and they would always say, like, it's so important to have a good math teacher. Like if I just had someone who could explain it well, I could get this stuff. And I started to think like, maybe I could be that kind of approachable and caring math teacher that could help kids that struggle. And so that's what I decided to do. I went to Davidson and I became a math major, which is kind of ironic because I learned all this college level math, knowing the whole time I wanted to teach high school math. So it was amazing and it taught me to think, and it was really challenging and fun. But the whole time I was like, I'm just going to go teach what I learned in 11th grade.
Like, this is extra credit, I guess.
Like maybe some kid that's super smart will ask me about linear algebra someday.
Maybe someday I'll remember this. If not, it's just more fun learning.
Yeah, well, it definitely gave me empathy for my students who struggled because it was pretty hard.
There you go.
But yeah, and then Davidson has well, at least when I was there, it was called an education concentration. So kind of like a minor. So I took like adolescent psychology and I did a placement my senior year where I was going to a school 3 times a week and kind of like shadowing high school math teachers. And it was great. But I knew all along that was what I wanted to do, which made some of my friends jealous. Like, oh my gosh, you just want to be a math teacher. Now you're just going to go be a math teacher. It's kind of not really the path for many.
That's who everyone wants to be, the clear cut path, no questions, you're not up at night. But then you had experience both obviously being a student and then shadowing at Davidson. When it came time to choose, you knew what grade based on your experience. How did you choose what type of school? Boarding school is very specific.
Yeah, so I went to an independent school myself in Atlanta, and I knew that if I wanted to do public school, I would have to get a certification. And I wanted to kind of make sure, I wanted to, I guess, kind of try it out before I like invested a lot more time in schooling. So the independent school path is like you have a major in the subject that you want to teach. And then the summer before my senior year at Davidson, I worked at the Andover summer session that you mentioned. So that was between junior and senior year of Davidson. Again, just to be like, let me actually try this teaching thing out and make sure it's a good fit. So that was my first exposure to boarding school because it was like a 5-week summer program. And then I just kind of ended up, so I was looking at schools in Charlotte and in DC because that's where I had friends from Davidson who were planning to move in those places. And I interviewed at Episcopal, and just walking around the campus and through my interview felt really connected and felt at home. And I honestly didn't know what I was getting myself into. Like I didn't, it's not like I set out to work at a boarding school. It just kind of happened. And senior at Davidson, it was like, great, I have a job. Like I was only thinking kind of 1 year at a time at that point. Like I'll just do this for a year and see how it goes. Um, I assumed I might move back to Atlanta. I really didn't know what I would do, but I knew I had friends to live with and I knew I had a job. So I was happy. And
Whoa.
yeah, and then here I am 17 years later, it just kind of was a fit, and it's been awesome. I mean, it's really fulfilling work. And now I have 2 kids, and here we are doing boarding school life.
Boarding school life, teaching math, not using the college math, but still loving it.
Right. Still loving it. Still thankful for the time because yeah,
Best
did
of
all
both
these crazy
worlds.
problem sets. Yeah.
And then for someone who's listening to this and says, yeah, either they already knew they wanted to do that like you, or
Sure.
maybe compelled by listening, if they want to follow your path, what advice would you have for someone who wants to become a high school teacher, let's say?
Yeah. Well, first of all, for a Davidson student, I would say like lean on your Davidson alumni network and resources. When I interviewed, there was someone on the faculty who went to Davidson, and I'm not saying that got me the job, but it's a small enough school that that's just like an immediate connection with people. And it kind of like put your resume on top of the pile. If there is someone with a Davidson connection, there's just that Davidson people love Davidson people. And then if you want to go the independent school route, there's a organization called Carney Sando that I used. It's like a placement agency that, you can send all your stuff, and then they'll send you back, like, here are all the schools all over the country that have openings. So it kept it from being less overwhelming to lean into something like that. And yeah, I'd also just say, don't get discouraged, like get your foot in the door where you can. I've seen people who like took a maternity leave position coverage, and then the school loved them. So then the next year there was a place. So, if or you could be a sub, just kind of find a way to get into a school community. And then schools tend to do a nice job if it seems like a good fit of sort of finding a way to keep people on.
Just let your work speak for itself, and
Yeah.
hard and it will work out. And any advice on in terms of the agency you mentioned sounds super helpful for finding
Yeah.
out about openings
Mhm.
for the interview process or application. Any tips there?
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, if for boarding school particularly, I think anything about kind of valuing the community and being excited about kind of like educating the whole child, not just the classroom academic side of things, is kind of what boarding schools are all about. So assuming you actually feel that way, emphasizing that in your interview,
If it's true.
yeah, that's what I tend to listen out for when interviewing folks myself. Like, why are you excited about being a part of a community, not just about the teaching part of things? Um, and yeah, like anything about working with teenagers, I guess anything, people are going to assume you want to teach the material. So any other things that you have to offer, like if you're excited about coaching a sport or being involved in another way, just kind of showing that you're committed to being a part of things outside of just your teaching field, I think comes across well.
Yeah, understanding really what's unique about the role that you
Yeah,
mentioned today and why that would be a good fit for you, it sounds like.
exactly.
Well, thank you so much for sharing what's unique about this role and what you do in depth so people can see whether or not it is a good fit.
For
Appreciate you.
sure. Yeah, thanks so much.